Como wilna o Hawaii o Hawaii no amos. He pula ba kaina he naka Hawaii lava valena no ikalani lava onu. Maya kia wapa no ya mage kia wakamoku me kaonwa paaya ikalava ya lani kalimaka wake paila ila ikia hemo. Mai ka puka ana kala I ka hikina, ai kona moe ana I ke komohana, aloha mai kākou e nā hoa no I no velo. Nā kia I ho'i, e mālama mai nā vai o nā kupuna, I me mau ana ka ike kupuna no nā hanauna e hiki mai ana. Aloha pumehana kākou. Welcome everyone to Hoʻokele Naʻauao, a Hawaiian Librarianship Symposium 2020. We are so grateful to all of you for joining us this year. For, especially in such a time of constant change and instability and uncertainty. So please know that we are grateful for you engaging in these discussions for us. And please know that we are sending aloha to all of you and to all of your families. Okay, so what are we doing here today? What is this thing, Hoʻokele Naʻauao? So believe it or not, this is the 7th instance of Hoʻokele Naʻauao. The name for this symposium was given by one of our co-conveners, Kavena Kumiji, back in 2013. So Hoʻokele Naʻauao literally means to sail towards knowledge. So we carry this metaphor as we engage with the topic of Hawaiian librarianship and its many facets. Speaking of Kavena, I want to send a special mahalo to her and Siobhan Matsuda for spearheading this year's event. If we could all please give them a huge round of applause. They deserve a huge, huge thanks for their efforts and energies pulling this all together. We'd also like to send a special thank you to our sponsors, the Institute of Museum and Library Services and World Indigenous Nations University, Hawaii Pacifica. From WinU, we'd like to recognize Uncle Peter Hanohano and Tema Watson for all of their support of the Laualau Ka'ike project. Mahalo, Uncle Peter and Tema. So the theme for this year's Ho'okele is activation of Kaiāulu, where Kaiāulu can be understood as community. In 2019, the Lahui Hawaiʻi, the Hawaiian nation, was reawakened through the Kukiaʻi Mauna and Aloha Aina movements. As some of you might know, the University of Hawaii and the TMT International Observatory are trying to erect a 30-meter telescope on top of Mauna Kea, one of our most sacred spaces. The Kukiaʻi Mauna movement, which is firmly committed to the protection of our land and nation, brought the environmental and social justice issues of Native Hawaiians to the world. We as caretakers of Hawaiian knowledge have a responsibility to respond and become active players in this fight for justice. And so we centered this year's Ho'okele around the following questions. In what ways can we, as information professionals, better support Indigenous communities? How can we be more respectful and mindful of the voices, data, and resources that we promote? And how are we sharing and preserving our mo'olelo, our stories, our histories for future generations? To help us think through these questions, we are humbled to feature an incredible lineup of speakers. Over the next 2 days, you'll hear from Sandy, Sophia, Abigail, and Lessa, all of whom are committed to advancing Indigenous communities. Some of these conversations might be a little bit uncomfortable, maybe even triggering. Talking about social justice means grappling with oppressive systems. So we ask each of you to reflect deeply on your kulana and kuleana, your positionality and your privileges and responsibilities. We are committed to maintaining a safe space for all of us to learn and grow. And if at any time you feel unsafe or if you witness harmful behavior, please let a session moderator know. or email us at nahawaiʻimiloa@gmail.com. As this year's Ho'okele is dedicated to social justice, we will be prioritizing marginalized voices. So for Q&A, if you choose to self-identify as belonging to a marginalized group, especially BIPOC communities, and you'd like to ask a question, you can include an asterisk at the start of your question. Our moderators will know to prioritize those questions. Additionally, when it comes to questions, we ask that you consider the framework put forth by Eve Tuck in regards to peer reviewing your question. Consider, is this really a question? Are you implying you should have given the talk? Does the question need to be asked and answered in front of everyone? And lastly, is the question asking the speaker to do additional work that you should perhaps be doing yourself? Now, without further ado, I'm very excited to introduce our opening speaker for Hoʻokele Naʻauao, Dr. Sandra Littletree. Sandra Littletree is an assistant teaching professor at the University of Washington Information School. Her research interests lie at the intersections of Indigenous systems of knowledge and librarianship. She is a past president of the American Indian Library Association and was the program manager of Knowledge River at the University of Arizona from 2009 to 2012. She currently lives in Olympia, Washington, and is originally from the Four Corners region of New Mexico. She is a descendant of the Eastern Shoshone tribe and is a citizen of the Navajo Nation. Please, everyone, let's give a warm welcome to Sandy Littletree.
Thank you so much. Thank you, thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm hoping that everyone who's hearing my voice is feeling well today. I'm seeing some greetings and some familiar names in the chat, and that's really nice to see. It's a real honor to be invited to give this talk today, especially after seeing the other invited speakers who'll be sharing this digital space in the coming days. So I'm very humbled that the organizers of this event asked me to share some words with you today. So I'm going to start sharing my screen here before I forget. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Yat ebene. She Sandy Littletree in a she. Eastern Shoshone Nishlant do Kia Ani Bashashin. Eastern Shoshone Dasha Che do Tatnazani Dashanella. Akot ego dine adzan Nishle. I am a citizen of the Navajo Nation, but I'm not fluent in my own language, so I ask for forgiveness and patience with my Diné relatives and ancestors for my very westernized tongue. As mentioned, I'm originally from Northwest New Mexico, but I'm coming to you from my home in Olympia, Washington, which is about 60 miles south of Seattle, if you've ever been here. And the place where I live with my husband and our dog is near the southern part of the Puget Sound, near the Salish Sea, in the area that's traditionally known as Stechas, the place where the black bears gather. And I live and I work in the territory of the Coast Salish people, particularly the Squaxin Island people. To my north are the Nisqually and Puyallup people. To the south are the Chehalis. To the west are the Skokomish people, among others who have all been caretakers of the Salish Sea for many generations. And as a Navajo woman, I'm a guest here. I'm married into the Squaxin Island tribe, but I'm still learning the cultures, the histories, the community connections here. I'm from the high desert, and so I am constantly learning and relearning this relationship with water and rain here in the Pacific Northwest. We are just getting into our dark and gray season, and so I'm still learning to be grateful for that because I know it's really needed for the plants and animals here. So thank you again for taking time out of your day to listen to me talk. As we've mentioned, these are different times for gathering, different ways of engaging with people that we wish we could be in the same room with. I wish I could be there with you in Hawaii, sharing stories and food and laughter, and getting to know each of you in the normal way, right? But we'll make do with what we have available, which is what we always do as Indigenous people, right? So if you're anything like me, you get excited about all of these events and speakers that you can now stream into your home, topics that maybe you've always wanted to learn about, conferences you've always wanted to attend, even if they are pixelated versions of what we once enjoyed in person, pixelated versions of communities. And we have now so many just awesome online events, workshops, symposiums. It's hard to keep track sometimes. I just want to admit that I register for a lot of things and then I realize I can't carve out time to be fully present. But that's okay. You know, we're all trying to balance our day with our family life and working from home or working in new ways in our institutions with masks and social distancing, especially those of us in the States. So I just want to acknowledge that, you know, this time and space that we're in, and that some of you may be tuning in while you're feeding your children or folding laundry or washing dishes or helping patrons or your students over email or other digital ways. I can't see you, unfortunately. I can see names popping up, and I did see names popping up in the chat. So feel free to, you know, look out the window, look at the sky, stand up and stretch, pet your dog or cat, look away from the screen, do what you need to do to keep your body and your mind healthy. I probably didn't have to tell you that, but I just wanted to acknowledge that. And if this recording survives the test of time, some of you might be listening to this sometime in the future, months or years down the road. And I look forward to talking with you sometime about how 2020 finally ends. So wherever you are, whatever's going on in your life at this moment, I just want to acknowledge you. Thank you for being here and taking time away from in your day to be here. And that hopefully you can get something out of the words and ideas that I'm going to share with you today. And I also want to acknowledge, you know, these past few weeks and months of 2020 have been challenging for many of us. Some of us have been dealing with sadness, isolation, heaviness of the world. But despite everything that our country and our world has been going through this year, you know, and the past 4 years, the past 400 years, our communities remain. You know, we've endured. And I don't know about you, but I can't forget about how much our ancestors have endured as they have fought to remain on their lands, to continue doing their ceremonies, to continue speaking their languages, to continue being in community, and continue living here, you know, on this land, on these waters. And we will continue to endure, continue our connections to land and water, because being Indigenous to a place means living as if your children's futures mattered, to take care of the land as if our lives, both material and spiritual, depend on it. And that's partially some words from Braiding Sweetgrass, Robin Wall Kimmerer, which I've been reading over and over again. And so, you know, we've had some good news this weekend, right? It was a time for celebration for sure, but also a time for reflection, for growth and action. And I think that's why we're here today. And this is perfect timing for this symposium. I don't claim to hold all the answers. I just want to put that out there right now. At heart, I'm a teacher that, you know, just wants to share knowledge and to open up minds and hearts and think in different ways. I'm also not a poet. I'm not a skilled orator. I'm not a storyteller. I stumble over my words. I may be slow to respond sometimes because I'm always thinking about what to say next. But I say this partially because I've been listening to some of my favorite Native poets give readings recently over the web. Joy Harjo and Lucy Tapahanso were two of the ones that I heard this weekend. And I've been listening to many skilled speakers and narrators like Robin Wall Kimmerer narrate her book. So sometimes I feel intimidated in these spaces when the spotlight is on me, wanting to shrink back into my shell, into my safe cocoon, and wondering, why am I here? Why was I asked to speak to you today? But I know why I'm here. I do feel a sense of responsibility to give back and to share some knowledge. I've been given a lot of gifts over the years, gifts of time and energy and attention, the gift of education, the ability and the space and time to write and think, which I know is a privilege that a lot of people don't have. And so this is my way of giving back. And in a culture of reciprocity, we give gifts and we receive gifts. And this is my time to give, but I'm also hoping that that we're all thinking about how we can give back and receive and give gifts. And also living here in the Pacific Northwest, I'm learning all the time about the importance of the potlatch, right? Where wealth is measured in how much you give away rather than how much you possess. So I'm happy to be with you today to share some of the things that I've been thinking about for a long time. I've been writing about for a few years and presenting on. And some of you may have already heard versions of this talk. So I think, sometimes we need to hear things over again. For myself, it's helpful for me to represent and repackage and think about different ways of sharing this knowledge. So I hope you don't mind, some repetition if you've heard me present on some of these ideas before. But the title of my talk today is Breathing Life into the Circles, Communities, Knowledge, and Action. And so I want to talk about the importance of circles on different levels. And I want to talk about breath, the act of sharing breath and life, breathing life into something, and that action or movement that's needed to do this work. Hopefully, this is actually the first time I've given a talk, since this article came out. So some of you may have already read this and may be able to connect with what I'm saying based on having read this article. But in this recent article that I co-wrote with doctors Marisa Duarte and Miranda Belardi-Lewis, we used circles. We used circles to depict the important role of relationality and relational accountability in the LIS world. If you read it, you might notice that we were writing for a major publication in the field of knowledge organization, where we knew our readers would be mostly non-native professionals and scholars. But we also definitely wanted to speak. We definitely wanted to speak to them, but we also wanted to speak to those who are practicing what we're calling and what others have called Indigenous librarianship. Which is that practice of librarianship that honors Indigenous ways of knowing, relationality, relational accountability, while privileging Indigenous people and communities, including their inherent sovereignty and their rights to control their systems of knowledge, which I'm interested to hear in maybe conversations here about the differences between that and Hawaiian librarianship, which I imagine is very similar, but maybe has some more specific aspects to it. But in this article, we wanted to alert readers to the inherent colonialism, right, that exists in Western institutions, information institutions, in the various ways that we think about the collection, classification, manipulation, storage, movement, retrieval, dissemination, and protection of information and knowledge. But we also wanted to contribute scholarship that centers Indigenous ways of knowing. And for us, circles were a very natural way to do this. Many Native groups have used circles for content to symbolize different things. Maybe the beginning, you know, the place where everything begins and life kind of echoes out from that center. Circles, as you know, for many Native people are a symbol of balance, wholeness, completeness, and wellness. I was inspired by Joanne Archibald's use of concentric circles in her book, Indigenous Storywork, where she shows how, quote, both the synergetic influence of and our responsibility towards generations of ancestors, the generation of today, and the generations yet to come, where the animal, human kingdoms, the elements of nature and land, and the spirit world are important parts of these concentric circles. I've also been reading Laura Harjo's book, Spiral to the Stars. And in her book, she talks about the role of spirals, the circles that are always in flux, always in movement, an element of her Southeastern cultural symbolic languages with repeating circulinear patterns, which are forms of communicating ideas and have a sensibility of movement embedded in them. It's a beautiful book talking about the Muskogee ways of knowing. And she uses that symbol of a spiral to talk about Muskogee and indigenous futurity, relating to the stomp dance spirals, you know, the movement of dancers and singers, relatives and spectators, the action and the movements that happen inside and outside of those circles that maintain kinship, communities, and lifeways. Circles are also really intuitive. I was talking the other day with my mentor, Cheryl Matoyer, about circles, and we were talking about how, you know, circles allow us to know where we're going, and we can see where we've been and where we're headed when we're moving in these circles. So it's in the spirit that I want to present my circles to you today. And I've been calling them the circles because it's an easy way to relate to this. When I talked to my co-authors about this article, when I talked to my husband who helped me to come up with this imagery, I talk about the circles, and we're all starting to know what we're talking about. And this is part of the circles. This is an image of a simplified version, simplified model of Indigenous systems of knowledge, where you can see the concepts of relationality and holism at the center, as well as peoplehood, Indigenous ways of knowing, expressions of Indigenous knowledge, institutions, and the values of respect, responsibility, and reciprocity. These are all layered in this cyclical and interlaced structure. I actually created this model in response to a non-native mentor, an ally, colleague, who was on my dissertation committee, and who asked me to be more clear about the definitions and relationships among the terms I was using in my written work. And, you know, to me, it was really obvious, you know, what I was talking about when I was talking about relationality and expressions of Indigenous knowledge or approaches to knowledge. But I realized that I needed a bridge, some kind of a boundary spanner that could help me communicate these ideas to non-native audiences, and help to clarify like what were these ideas in my head. And so I rendered this conceptual model to visually depict how these components are working together, at least from what I was seeing in my research and observing, and also, you know, being an Indigenous person myself, you know, how are these components working together to shape our Indigenous ways of interacting in the world. And so I want to also just give a shout out to that mentor, Allison Carlisle, who was the one that pushed me and challenged me with her gentle questions about these terminology. And she passed away earlier this year, but she's, you know, her influence on this work is still very important. And I just want to acknowledge that. So the, you know, and the components of this circle are really to achieve a goal, which is, you know, this right relationship that we have in this life, you know, and having a good life. So I want to go through each of these layers. So bear with me. Like I said, if you've heard me speak about this diagram before, this might be a repeat, but hopefully, you know, you may be able to get something out of this. I think I may have mentioned this, you know, before. You know, sometimes we have to hear things again in our Indigenous ways of being. We're always hearing repeats of stories. So hopefully, if this is a repeat for you, it's an opportunity to just think about these concepts again. And then just to be really clear that this is a very generic framework, so it's not meant to be tribally specific. So while you can apply, you know, specific tribal ways of being into this framework, which is what we did in the article, we broke it down using a Navajo example with weaving, and then Miranda Belardi-Lewis worked on the Zuni example in the article. So you can apply this to different tribal ways of knowing, but it's not meant to replace anything that's specific or other philosophies or other spiritual thinkings, spiritual teachings from different tribes. And then also really quickly, hopefully you can see that there are no solid lines in this diagram. Each of these circles have dashed lines because none of these elements are working in isolation. You know, they're all impacting each other. Some are stronger than others. So I imagine this like a drop of water that centers on that relationality. And depending how strong that is and how permeable all the layers are, including that outer layer of institutions, it will allow that energy of that relationality to be carried all the way into the institutions. And if it's treated with respect, and that energy can be reciprocated and carried back into communities, and hopefully, you know, back into that source of relationality. And then before I get into the details, I also want us to think about how you can help me to breathe life into these circles. And what I mean is to give, you know, to give them life so that they aren't just stuck in those academic papers or on this PowerPoint slide or in this Zoom recording. When I think about breathing life into something, I think about our Navajo creation stories and the importance of breath in creating the first people, the holy wind that gives us life. I also think about the greetings from our friends and colleagues in Pacifica, you know, the pressing of noses and foreheads, the sharing of the breath of life as one of the first things that you do in establishing connections and relationships with other people. So as I'm going through these different layers, think about, you know, what are some ways that you can imagine yourself breathing life into this diagram? How can this help you in your work? I'm interested to hear how you maybe see this being applicable in your world. And that's one of the things that I miss of, giving this presentation in person, is sometimes I'll have people come up afterwards and talk to me about, how they connected to it. So feel free to, think about that and think about, what can we do with this? Because I'm really interested in not having it just be in a dusty article. Okay, so I'm gonna go back to this diagram, full diagram in a second, and take away some pieces. So I want to focus on those outer two layers, the institutions and those expressions of Indigenous systems of knowledge. In mainstream Western practices, we're often really focused on the surface level, right? It's easier to see. It's easier to see the institutions and the objects, the stuff, the expressions of Indigenous knowledge that show up in books and articles and documents and films, things that we can collect and maintain in our collections. We try to come up with descriptions and organizational practices for this stuff, or ways to display them. We showcase photos of unidentified Native people and locations in our digital collections. We do a lot of things, with this stuff in our institutions. And sometimes this is done without considering the core of where these expressions come from, without it focusing on the humans and the ontologies and the epistemologies that have informed the stuff, the expressions, and without acknowledging the impacts of colonization that have happened on these communities of origin. So we have to remember that there is the center here, this core of how things ended up in our institutions. And how do we begin to fill in this gap? And the first step is to understand the importance of relationality. Relationality is what distinguishes Indigenous ways of knowing from Western knowledge in a really important way. As many of you probably know, Indigenous people, through our relationships, we belong to our landscapes, our places, languages, histories, ceremonies, people, families, nations, and clans. And that responsibility to our belonging helps us live a balanced and good life. I depend on Cree scholar Sean Wilson's conception of relationality, or that acknowledgement that we all exist in relationship to each other, to the natural world, to ideas, to objects, ancestors, the cosmos, to future generations, and that we're accountable to those relationships. So it's really important, this relational way of being. It might be considered the heart of what it means to be Indigenous. Relationality is dynamic. It allows us to actively participate in our world, ensuring that our interactions are compassionate, loving, and caring as we become accountable to those that we relate to. As Wilson states, identity for Indigenous people is grounded in the relationships with land, their ancestors who have returned to the land, and with future generations who will come to being on the land. So rather than viewing ourselves as being in relationship with other people or things, we are the relationships that we hold and that are a part of. And the relationships energize the ways that we interact with the world, and the ways of knowing that emerge from those experiences. Relationality is also informed by holism, which is that concept described by Joanne Archibald that I showed in an earlier slide, that refers to those interrelations between that intellectual, spiritual, emotional, physical realms that form a whole healthy person, as well as healthy communities. So once you understand that everything starts with relationships, then we start to fill in the rest of those gaps. And for me, I filled in this gap with the most important things that Indigenous people have relationships with. Belonging to a people is an integral part of what it means to be Indigenous. And so this peoplehood is depicted in this, this next layer. The peoplehood model is it's a concept that I've picked up on, that's depicted in this image by Tom Holm, Diane Pearson, and Ben Chavez. And it situates an Indigenous person's sense of self and belonging as the outcome of our connections to language, sacred history, ceremonial cycle, and continuous habitation within a place or territory. So a person is Indigenous because their relationships within these spheres of activities is determined by their people. And these are the elements that make up that layer that I have directly outside of relationality. Because these are the things that people are having really strong relationships with. But I also acknowledge that for some Indigenous people, their relationships with these elements may be stronger or weaker because of colonization, right? Colonization displaced a lot of people from their territories, traditional territories, and experiences of removal, assimilation, boarding schools have corroded Indigenous people's relationships with languages, lands, and ceremony. But despite the effects of colonialism, Indigenous people continuously interact with these activities that define peoplehood, even if the strongest relationships existed with their ancestors. Okay, we're filling in the next layer, which is that third layer from the center. And these are the Indigenous ways of knowing. So we're almost done with this, with filling in this circle. Indigenous ways of knowing are the activities that we do in the peoplehood matrix that inform Indigenous systems of knowledge. These are the ways that Native people have been creating, transmitting, categorizing, and preserving knowledge since the beginning of time. So these are the verbs. These are those active processes, such as story work, observing, creating art, relating to elders and children, planting, cooking, dancing, praying, hunting, fishing, listening, running, dreaming. You can imagine the circle could be filled with just endless activities, such as the ones that are here. And these are the experiences that we have when we exercise our relationship with family, clan, ideas, and those elements of peoplehood. Exercise our relationship with language, land, ceremonies, and our sacred history. So these actions are really important, and it reminds me of that spiral that Harjo, that I mentioned earlier from Harjo. So you might imagine like this, the movement of the stomp dancers, and communicating ideas and sharing knowledge across generations because of this movement, because of these actions. And then again, we're back at those surface layers, those expressions of Indigenous systems of knowledge. So we're at the second to the surface level. Those expressions of Indigenous knowledge are what comes out of these actions. These are the manifestations of our cultures. So these can be the tangible stuff, you know, taking the physical form of, you know, weaving, pottery, buildings, architecture, weapons, calendars, gardens, or the intangible manifestations such as songs, prayers, dances, gardening practices, food recipes, hunting techniques, medicinal plant knowledge. In our article, we relied on White Earth Chippewa and Choctaw scholar Clara Sue Kidwell's description of expressions of Indigenous knowledge, which are those discernible manifestations of knowledge. So these are the nouns that are created when we exercise our relationship with land, water, ceremonies, people, stories, teachings, and observations. So again, these are the tangible and intangible objects that come out of those activities that we have. And then finally, we have, those are some of the expressions of Indigenous knowledge. So we have the surface level, that outermost layer that we're all in, right? I'm imagining many of you are in libraries, archives, in some kind of academic institution. These are the institutions that may be collecting, cataloging, preserving these expressions of Indigenous systems of knowledge. And for some institutions, their approach to this knowledge might be just to address, like I said, those top two layers of this model. They might be superficially, dealing with those expressions of knowledge. And I think that this can be really a narrow-minded approach, resulting in a perpetuation of ignorance about the essence of the objects or the things, the ideas, even the people that are working and contributing to our institutions. Not understanding the communal and family relationships and the complex ways of knowing that resulted in their being there. And ignoring relationality that's infusing these things, these manifestations. Institutions can risk breach of protocol with engaging with Indigenous communities. But there's also, we can imagine and we know of a lot of institutions that are employing practices that actively acknowledge relationality, that's undergirding the creation of Indigenous knowledge. They have an understanding that, the line separating the layers isn't solid, so they have this room for relationality to radiate, not just understanding that it's radiating to the expressions of Indigenous knowledge, but also into their practices, their policies, pedagogy, methods of research, and more. And so there are a lot of possibilities for making spaces for how Indigenous people engage with the world, with people, places, and ideas when you focus first on that means of creating relationships. And then finally, in this diagram, I want to address what's cradling that system. Reciprocity, responsibility, and respect. The importance of handling knowledge with respect and responsibility stems from that core, relationality. Anishinaabe scholar Alison Krebs reinforces this idea, reminding us that, quote, as Indigenous peoples, we exist within dynamic and interactive webs of relationship governed by mutual respect, reciprocity, and relational accountability. So I designed this part of the model to resemble a cradle because of the importance of cradles and cradle boards for many Native communities as a way to protect future generations. There are a lot of unwritten protocols that govern relational accountability in Indigenous communities, such as knowing when and how to receive gifts, understanding seasonal influences on like stories and teachings, honoring clan member responsibilities in orally transmitted activities, informing our relational way of being. Some of these are unwritten, some of these are written. And institutions that hold Indigenous knowledge may implement various methods to incorporate relational accountability into their collections, into their research practices. Advocates may apply guidelines such as like the protocols for Native American archival materials, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander protocols for libraries, archives, and information. And there's several more that help to develop respect for Indigenous systems of knowledge, or even just engaging with decolonizing methodologies from Linda Tuhei Smith or other Indigenous focused research methods to base their work. So this is the full diagram. And to understand and make room for Indigenous perspectives in research and libraries, in our practices, which, I mean, you know, the Native and how Indigenous people are creating protocols to name and articulate and collate and make accessible objects and documents and materials that indicate Indigenous knowledge. It requires that librarians and archivists, educators, researchers recognize that importance of relationality. And it's imperative to be accountable to all of our relationships throughout our work. And just some reflections that I've had as I've gone through, you know, revising this talk and given this talk again. One was really, you know, to focus on actions, you know, the verbs and the things that Indigenous people are doing to engage in the world with ideas, with people and places, especially now. You know, we want to demonstrate that Indigenous ways of knowing are contemporary, they're constantly moving, and they're focused on creating relationships, as well as activating communities, right? So this is really different from seeing knowledge as static or unchanging, you know, something that needs to be captured for the sake of being captured and documented for the sake of being documented, or for the benefit of external groups or organizations or governments, right? So seeing this as, you know, a part of contributing to that continuing action that Indigenous people are engaged in. So another goal is, you know, to think about how we can use this model in this moment today, when activating communities is so important for continual survival of lifeways, of memories, of just being, of surviving a pandemic, of surviving isolation and, you know, being in these digital spaces. You know, how can we use this in a way that helps our communities today? The other thing, when I look at the framework and when I share it with Native people, I'm just going to go back to it if I can, is that it seems really obvious to me. The more I talk about it and the more I present on it or, you know, share with different people, it seems so obvious. So maybe it's just me like getting used to, you know, getting to maybe tired, not tired of it, but it seems really obvious. And when I gave this presentation, you know, earlier, I was telling my sister about this article and she was asking me about presentations I was giving, and I was telling her about the article and trying to explain, you know, these circles. And it felt kind of silly trying to describe like this way of being that's just second nature to many of our families, those in our communities. My sister, you know, isn't a librarian, and isn't, you know, in academia. Same with my dad. You know, a few years ago, he was asking me about what I'm teaching, and I tell him, you know, I'm teaching a class called Indigenous Systems of Knowledge, and he's like, "What is that?" You know, so, you know, these are very academic terms. So, you know, like I mentioned at the beginning, I really am interested to hear like your thoughts on how, you know, we can breathe life into these circles that make sense for our communities, make sense for the work that we do, and also, you know, how we can contribute to this thing called Indigenous information science or Indigenous librarianship, Hawaiian librarianship. You know, these circles and these images have been in my brain and in my heart for many years as I was trying to articulate, you know, what is it that makes Indigenous librarianship and Indigenous information science different from the other concepts that I was reading about and seeing in the field and not seeing that Indigenous perspective. And so, you know, publishing this article and presenting on this and hopefully having a conversation with you all today hopefully this will serve as, a tool that we can use, to show justification for reciprocal, responsible relationship building, as well as the labor that becoming informed about relationality in the context of Indigenous knowledge organization or just information science in general. What I'm hoping is that this might be integrated into LIS and knowledge organization curriculum and trainings as, this visual representation of a broader Indigenous knowledge framework. And finally, I just want to acknowledge, some of the scholars and authors, librarians, archivists who have helped inform my work that I've listed here. I can't list them all, but I just want to acknowledge them that, these ideas have been gelling and come from a lot of different areas of research and thinking. So I want to thank them all, and thank you for sitting through this. And I look forward to having a conversation with you all. So thank you.
Sandra, I'd just like to, it's weird. If we were in a space, I would ask everyone to give you a round of applause. I hope that everyone is doing so where they are. But I just want to say thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your energy and your efforts with us here today. I have like 5 pages of notes. I was really inspired by your talk today. Thank you so much.
Thank you for saying that.
There were a couple of questions. Oh, good. People are clapping in the chat.
I'm just now seeing the chat, so I didn't see any of it as I was talking. So.
Well, there were a couple of questions that came in. I was wondering if it's okay we start there for a bit.
Sure.
So a comment that we got was from Sarah DuPont. Hi, Sarah. She said, Sandy, thank you for your encouragement to us to be here as we can be. Your empathy is so heartwarming and appreciated. And I want to echo Sarah's comments. I think empathy is something that all of us can never have enough of. So thank you for setting this space and making it an empathetic one for us today.
Yeah, and hi, Sarah. I'm glad to see you here. Yeah, I think it's, just acknowledging our humanness. And I think that's what we're all here for, right? I do that a lot in my teaching. I'm teaching in the MLIS program at UW, and I think that came out a lot in the springtime, right? We're thrown into this situation, and just being empathetic and just recognizing, all of these things that are going on, and that we can't, work in the same way that we used to. And so it's just a part of how I look at life. And I know, a lot of times that I'm listening to these webinars, I'm also doing dishes or folding laundry or doing other things. So just, acknowledging that this is the space that we're in, and it'd be different if we were in a conference. We'd have a different energy, but I think we have to just, take what we can from these technologies and these spaces that we're in.
Yeah. We have a question from Fina Tifu, down or up, depending on where you're looking from, in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Fina's question is, she starts with a comment. Thank you, Sandy. You're a wonderful storyteller. Her question is, how do we protect Indigenous ways of knowing from exploitation, yet still be able to share it and evolve Indigenous knowledge and wisdom systems?
Yeah, I think that's why we're here, right? Understanding, I think, part of my philosophy of, presenting in places like this, and also, teaching, I struggle a lot, like if I should be, where I should put my energy, right? I could probably try to, work in a library. I could, work more you know, research or, you know, all these different avenues are, but I think as, you know, role for myself of just like educating people and opening up ideas, getting people to think about knowledge in a different way, especially as a, you know, for myself, you know, working in LIS, you know, I try to get people to come along with me and like just to imagine like different ways of thinking about knowledge and recognizing the problems with that colonialism has caused. Some people just aren't even aware, like it's never occurred to them that these issues, you know, that they've exploited stories or that, you know, there's things out there that shouldn't be out there. So just, you know, basic informing people, but, you know, in my approach, you know, doing it in a way that's not accusatory, but, you know, kind of understanding, you know, some of that history and bringing people along. So in my work, you know, I try to reach people at the beginning of their careers, right, as in LIS programs. And, you know, I'm hoping that this next generation of students that will be coming into leadership positions will be the ones that are making these pathways. But we also have a lot of people that have done really great work. And so learning from them, showcasing them that are actually doing the work in libraries and, you know, creating these protocols, implementing them in their libraries, showing them as good examples of ways of trying to overcome some of these challenges. I think it's going to take time. It's going to take a lot of time. I don't know if we'll ever, you know, get to a point where we're like totally satisfied with what's happened. Maybe, I don't know. We can cross our fingers, but, you know, we're in a space where we don't have enough Indigenous people or people that have gone through programs, you know, LIS programs, or gone to conferences or whatever to understand these issues. You know, we don't have enough Indigenous people in the field. So we're having to rely on a lot of allies, other people in leadership positions. So, you know, informing them about, you know, what we can do to move forward. So it's going to take, you know, everyone here of pushing things forward and, you know, taking on leadership positions and creating policies, practices. It'll take time.
And we've actually gotten a couple of follow-up questions to the topic that you just talked about. Rebecca Plavel, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Her question is, how do we introduce the concepts of IKS and ways of knowing to all students in LIS programs? I know you've got a little bit of experience with that, working with library school programs.
Yeah, how do we do that? Have them read our article. You know, I'm teaching the first, you know, we call it 520. It's the first class that all of the students are taking, and you know, getting them to think about Indigenous perspectives at the beginning is one way to do that. Also offering classes, maybe incorporating these, you know, types of symposium or recordings. You know, I think just, you know, privileging those Indigenous, Indigenous scholars in your LIS programs. There's a lot of really great things that have been written. Compared to when I was in library school, you know, there wasn't a lot, you know, being talked about. And that was, you know, like 15 years ago. So there's been a lot that's happened. And I think, you know, getting people to understand that a lot of things have happened. The other thing that really helped me when I was in library school and LIS programs was traveling and going to conferences, if you're able to. So I think, you know, in this time, it's a silver lining that, you know, people can log into this symposium from anywhere. You know, we don't have to get money to travel as much. So, you know, getting, you know, LIS students to sign up for these types of symposium offering more of them, even after, you know, this pandemic is over, you know, thinking about how to reach LIS programs and, you know, getting faculty involved in, you know, supporting this type of work in their curriculum as well. That's the other challenge, right, is most LIS programs don't have Indigenous faculty or, you know, an understanding of this. So, you know, I think we have to do a lot of outreach and, you know, showcasing of these authors and ways of knowing. Another way, perhaps, is service learning, getting students out into communities, which can also present other challenges, right, of protocols, and if you have no connections, and you're taking time to build relationships if you have zero. So that'll take time as well. But I think, you know, we have to start somewhere, even if it is just reading this article or reading other articles that are out there.
I really hear your statement about traveling and opening up your perspectives, especially when you're right, a lot of our programs don't have Indigenous faculty, don't have courses about Indigenous knowledge. That was definitely the experience, right? I think a lot of us here in Hawaii, our faculty aren't Indigenous, and we don't have, you know, a lot of classes talking about Hawaiian librarianship, Indigenous librarianship. But going to ATOM, like the first ATOM that I went to, just totally blew my mind. And it was a pivotal moment in my life for me, getting that experience to engage with the Indigenous librarianship community.
Yeah, for me it was going to ILF as a library school student. So the International Indigenous Librarians Forum was in Regina, Saskatchewan, when I was in library school. And that just, you know, and I was an Indigenous, you know, Native person coming into the field, and I had no idea about any of this stuff. You know, I came into the field thinking that I was gonna, you know, promote books. I was really that stereotypical, you know, I didn't really have a strong understanding of what the field was until I was able to travel and actually talk to Indigenous people around the world, you know, that had these different issues. So it was totally eye-opening for me.
And like you mentioned in your talk earlier, that just, they finally a sense of belonging.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. We have a question from Deborah Lee. Aloha, Deborah. Deborah says, Sandy, I really like the complexity represented in your circle's imagery. I'm wondering what response you've had from non-Indigenous peoples to this imagery / representation.
Hi, Deborah. I'm glad you're here. And this isn't the first time she's heard this, so or seen my presentation. So thank you for being here. You know, it's interesting. I've had people come up to me after giving this presentation who aren't Indigenous, who relate to this in a way of, you know, it's a very like human way of looking at, you know, where our knowledge and where information is coming from, and how to, you know, it's really not, it doesn't have to be specific to Indigenous people to understand, like, all of our knowledge and information is coming from some core, right? And so I actually had somebody come up to me after giving this presentation and say it, you know, it really was a light bulb moment for them to think about they're organizing a labor union archive, which was totally, you know, unexpected for me. I hadn't, you know, that's a community I'm not familiar with, but it resonated for them to, you know, just understand, like, there are some really core values in this community. There are things that they do. There are these objects that come out of those, you know, that activity, and then it ends up in these institutions. So it's really, you know, it can be a very like human, social way of looking at where knowledge and information is coming from, and, you know, whether or not, you know, in Indigenous communities, we have these, you know, specific protocols and maybe more connections to land and ceremonies. But all people have these relationships, and, you know, I think there's ways that we can, you know, expand this to other communities beyond Indigenous communities. So, you know, I haven't had anybody upset about it. It's always been a positive response.
And actually, if you have a follow-up question directly related to that question, what advice would you give to people stepping into knowledge organization work with libraries and archives? Is there an initial setting or foundation that you usually draw upon?
That's a good question. You know, it's interesting because I'm not a cataloger, and I'm not, you know, somehow I ended up, you know, thinking about these different, you know, concepts and labels. Actually almost dropped out of library school because of my cataloging class, because it was so, you know, foreign to me. I had never, you know, thought about, you know, mark records and like these standard ways of thinking about knowledge. And it, you know, I think about myself trying to use the library catalog and always searching for Native American education as a subject, and not realizing, you know, Library of Congress subject headings for us is Indians of North America, right? Never occurred to me how, you know, standardized things were as an undergrad. You know, totally didn't understand how to use libraries, didn't know I could ask for help. So, you know, I think, you know, for someone that's, you know, interested in cataloging and classification, just trying to put yourself in the position of people that have no idea, absolutely no idea of, you know, they're going into these systems with their own ways of thinking about this. And so, you know, looking at the labels that are there, you know, how helpful are they? What kind of barriers do they have? Joining different groups. There's, you know, there was a lot of work last couple of years in Canada, that sorting, what was it called? Sorting libraries out, I think. Yeah.
Sorting things out, something
Sorting
like
things
that?
out, yeah. So there's a lot of, you know, people that are actually catalogers and, you know, people that are trying to change systems. I think other countries, at least, you know, mainland US, aren't doing as much as, you know, Canada and Aotearoa and, you know, Australia and Hawaii. You know, I know you all are working on something. So, you know, learning learning from others who are doing the work, and, you know, finding out some of the issues, you know, finding out, you know, maybe ways that you can break into, you know, finding alternative ways of dealing with this information.
Yeah, building community has been really powerful for us, or we'd just be wandering around in the dark with no light. Yeah.
And I'm also thinking about, I would really recommend that article, Imagining, Marisa Duarte and Miranda Belarde Lewis, and they have these stages of imagining, like other ways of dealing with Indigenous knowledge. And the first stage in that process is understanding the role of colonialism. Like how did we get to this point? And how bad, you know, how has it impacted our systems? And it gradually moves you into a space where you're, you know, inviting Indigenous people into those rooms of like creating systems with them and not for them, right? So hopefully we can get to that stage where, you know, we can, you know, understand that Indigenous people have always been organizing things and labeling, but how do we get them in those spaces where they're the ones making the decisions? We're the ones making the decisions.
Right. There are several more questions, and I want to respect everyone's time, so I will compile the questions, Sandy, and send them to you. But I'll also send them to all of the participants afterwards, so we can just continue this dialogue. And if anyone's tweeting #Hoʻokele20, we can continue conversations there. I do want to ask one final question. You mentioned in your talk that sort of the goal is to have a good life. And so my question for you is, what does that look like for you?
Oh, that's a big question. I think it is, you know, understanding that we're in the space you know, not being, you know, putting on blinders to trauma or, you know, these ways that have impacted our families, our communities, but also, you know, trying to maintain those connections and using the tools that we have available, you know, whether it's technology, whether it's, you know, recording stories or, you know, being involved in communities in different ways. That's been, you know, it has been a challenge, especially this past year. You know, I haven't been able to see my family in New Mexico since December, which is, you know, really a challenge for me. And it feels like that's not the best way to live a good life, right? But, you know, we make do and we, you know, we survive and we use these tools to connect and move forward in our lives and try to maintain what we have and come out, you know, from this in a changed, but also hopefully, you know, finding other ways to connect with each other. And to me, you know, living a good life is, you know, getting outside of my screen, being with, you know, being on the land. And even though it's, you know, this land to me is not, I don't feel like I'm indigenous to this area, but, you know, appreciating it and understanding, you know, where I'm coming from.
Thank you, Sandy. Thank you so very much. I hope all of us in the participants in this Zoom space will join me in giving you a huge round of applause, in sending lots of aloha to you, lots of mahalo to you, lots of gratitude to you. Thank you again so much for joining us and for starting Hoʻokele Naʻauao on an amazing start.
Thank you for having me.
I thank you. I'm trying not to fangirl too much, but I am just, again, really grateful for you. I'm going to wrap up with a couple of housekeeping announcements for everyone. I'm sure, you know, like me, all of you have lots to think about after this morning's presentation from Sandy. And so we'd like to ask you to share your reflections. If you don't mind sharing them with us. You can share feedback, comments, reflections at the link in the chat, www.naHawaiʻiʻimiloa.com/evaluation.html. And I'd also like to encourage everyone to come and join us at 12 o'clock for Sophia's talk. If you haven't registered yet, you can go ahead and register. But lastly, I'd like to say thank you. Thank you to everyone for joining us this morning. Thank you so much again to Sandy for sharing space with us. We look forward to continuing these relationships. Mahalo, everyone. Ahui hoa kuno. Aloha no. Hui ho.